In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power. Europe had fallen in less than 2 years. France collapsed in 6 weeks, Poland in 30 days. To Hitler, history itself seemed outdated, slow, cautious, irrelevant. He told his generals that the Soviet Union would fall in weeks, that once the door was kicked in, the entire rotten structure would come crashing down. His generals were not so confident. They warned him about distance, about logistics, about the ghost of 1812, the silent lesson Napoleon learned the hard way. But Hitler dismissed them all. He believed ideology could defeat geography. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed into the largest land invasion in human history. At first, it worked. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Cities fell. The maps turned blue at a terrifying speed. Then, the advance began to slow. Trucks broke down. Supply lines stretched beyond reason. Tanks ran dry. Horses, yes, horses, were now hauling the backbone of Germany's modern army through oceans of mud. And while Berlin celebrated victory, a classified intelligence report arrived from Tokyo, warning that fresh Soviet divisions were waiting in Siberia, fully equipped for winter warfare. Hitler called it nonsense. By December, German soldiers were freezing to death within sight of Moscow's spires. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist. In just a few months, Hitler had lost over 500,000 men, not to a single decisive battle, but to arrogance, logistics, and a map he refused to respect. This is not the story of the Russian winter. This is the story of how one man's certainty turned the most powerful army on earth into a slow-motion disaster, and why the war was effectively lost long before Normandy. This is Operation Barbarossa. Many of us were raised on the legend of the Lightning War. We grew up hearing about the unstoppable machine that rolled over Poland in weeks and shattered the French army, supposedly the finest in the world, in just 46 days. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler wasn't just a dictator, he was a man who believed he had solved the riddle of modern warfare. He looked at the vast expanse of the Soviet Union and saw not a superpower, but a rotting structure that would come crashing down if he simply kicked in the front door. It's a classic trap, isn't it? The belief that because you've mastered a specific craft, the laws of physics and geography no longer apply to you. But there is a profound difference between a sprint and a marathon. And in June of 1941, the German High Command was dressed for a track meet while heading into a continental wilderness. Hitler's central illusion was that the Soviet Union could be dismantled using the same mechanical precision used in Western Europe. He predicted the entire campaign would be over in 9 to 12 weeks. Think about that for a moment. Conquering the largest country on Earth in the time it takes for a single season to change. It was a gamble based on the idea that the Red Army would collapse instantly under the weight of the Blitzkrieg. Therefore, when 3.8 million Axis soldiers crossed the border on June 22nd, they weren't prepared for a war. They were prepared for a victory lap. The reality, however, was what we might call the infinite horizon. In France, if you drive for a day, you hit the ocean. In Russia, you drive for a day and the horizon simply resets itself. The German planners looked at their maps and saw roads, but many of us who have spent time with heavy machinery know that a line on a map is not the same as the ground beneath your tires. The Soviet roads were often nothing more than dirt tracks that turned into a thick, soul-crushing glue known as Rasputitsa the moment the rain fell. This geographical scale acted like a giant sponge, soaking up the German momentum. Every mile they advanced meant their supply lines had to stretch a mile further. It's a simple law of tension. The further you pull the rubber band, the more likely it is to snap. Hitler's intelligence officers told him the Soviets had about 200 divisions. By the end of the first month, they had identified 360. For every Soviet army the Germans encircled and destroyed, two more seemed to rise from the steppe. It wasn't just a military conflict, it was an encounter with a mathematical impossibility. We often talk about overconfidence as a personality trait, but in the summer of 1941, it was a systemic failure. The German soldier was arguably the most professional tactical fighter in the world at that moment, but he was being led by a man who mistook his own propaganda for a strategic plan. They lacked winter clothing, they lacked synthetic oil that wouldn't freeze in the crankcase, and most importantly, they lacked a plan B. They had gambled everything on the illusion that the first blow would be the final blow. But as the sun began to set earlier and the horizon refused to end, the German high command began to realize they hadn't kicked in a door, they had stepped into a void. To understand the tragedy of 1941, we have to look back at the shadow that hung over every German general's map table, the year 1812. Most of us understand the old proverb that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But there's a more dangerous truth in high-stakes leadership. Sometimes those who do know history are so terrified of it that they end up sprinting right into the same trap. The ghost of 1812 refers, of course, to Napoleon Bonaparte. For the men leading the Wehrmacht, Napoleon wasn't just a figure in a textbook, he was the ultimate cautionary tale. He had marched into Russia with the largest army ever assembled to that point, won almost every battle, and even captured Moscow. Yet he returned with a skeleton of a force, his empire shattered by the very space he tried to conquer. History suggests that every generation believes its technology makes the lessons of the past obsolete. Hitler was no different. He looked at Napoleon's horse-drawn carriages and compared them to his Panzer divisions. To him, the ghost was a myth that only applied to the primitive. He argued that the internal combustion engine had conquered the Russian steppe. But history is a patient teacher. It waits for you to forget that the ground doesn't care how fast your engine is if the mud is 3 feet deep. The German officer corps, many of them classically educated men who had studied the Napoleonic campaigns in grueling detail, felt a cold shiver as they crossed the Niemen River, the exact same spot where Napoleon had crossed 129 years to the day. The first great lesson of 1812 was the scorched earth. Many of us remember the stories of Russian peasants burning their own crops and homes rather than letting them fall into enemy hands. In 1941, Hitler assumed the Soviet citizen would welcome the Germans as liberators from Stalin's iron fist. Therefore, he expected to live off the land. But the reality was a brutal therefore. Stalin, much like Tsar Alexander I before him, issued a scorched earth decree. As the Germans advanced, they didn't find granaries full of wheat or depots full of fuel. They found smoldering ruins and poisoned wells. The Germans were winning the territory, but they were inheriting a desert. Every mile they gained increased their hunger. They were effectively winning their way into starvation. If you've ever driven through the American Midwest, you know the feeling of a road that never turns. Now imagine that road is the only supply line for 1 million men. Napoleon's failure wasn't just the winter, it was the attrition of the march. Even before the first snowflake fell in 1812, Napoleon had lost 1/3 of his army to disease, exhaustion, and desertion. The German generals pointed this out. They warned that the further the Panzers drove, the more vulnerable their umbilical cord became. But Hitler's response was a classic example of hubris overriding experience. He believed that the speed of the Blitzkrieg would finish the war before the supply lines even mattered. He saw history as a hurdle to be jumped rather than a wall to be respected. There is a psychological weight to the Russian landscape that we often overlook. In Western Europe, you're always close to a village, a church spire, or a sign of civilization. In the East, the scale is so vast it begins to weigh on a soldier's mind. The German diarists of 1941 began to sound remarkably like the French diarists of 1812. They spoke of the melancholy of the endless birch forests and the terrifying silence of the nights. Therefore, the experience that should have taught Hitler to be cautious instead became his greatest enemy. He tried to outrun the ghost of Napoleon by moving faster, pushing harder, and demanding the impossible. But as the summer of '41 turned into a dusty autumn, the German army realized they weren't just fighting the Red Army, they were fighting the same ghost that had buried the Grande Armée. They were learning, far too late, that in Russia, the land is the greatest weapon of all. When we think of the Second World War, we often picture the sleek, motorized precision of the Panzer divisions, the steel tip of the spear. But there is a gritty, unglamorous reality that the history books often gloss over. Behind those tanks was an army that looked more like something out of the 19th century than the 20th. It's one of the great ironies of history. The most technologically advanced military of its time was actually powered by the humble horse. For a man sitting in an armchair today, it's easy to assume that modern means motorized, but for the German high command, the math was far more brutal. Germany lacked the oil reserves of the United States or the Soviet Union. While the Panzers grabbed the headlines, nearly 80% of the German army relied on horse-drawn transport. Imagine, if you will, a top-of-the-line Mercedes trying to keep pace with a pony and trap. That was the reality of the invasion. The tanks would race ahead, creating massive gaps between the fighting front and the food, ammunition, and fuel following behind them. In the dry heat of June, this was a manageable headache, but history suggests that in Russia, the weather is not just a backdrop, it is a combatant. Many of us who have worked on a farm or a construction site know that not all mud is created equal. In Russia, there is a phenomenon called the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. When the autumn rains hit the fine, silty soil of the Soviet steppe, the earth doesn't just get wet, it liquefies. This is where the nightmare began. A truck has a specific ground pressure. Once the mud reaches the axle, the vehicle is no longer a transport tool, it's an anchor. The German motor transport, designed for the paved roads of France and Germany, simply sank. Therefore, the burden fell entirely back onto the horses. A horse is a living machine. It needs 10 times the weight in fodder as a truck needs in fuel. As the roads disappeared, the horses began to die by the thousands. They weren't just dying from the work, they were dying because the mud was so thick it would literally suck the shoes off their hooves, leaving them to collapse from exhaustion in the freezing slush. Now, you might ask, why not use the trains? It's a logical question. In Western Europe, the railroad was the spine of the military, but the Soviets, perhaps anticipating an invasion, had built their tracks to a wider gauge than the rest of Europe. When the Germans captured a Soviet rail line, they couldn't just run their trains onto it. The wheels wouldn't fit. They had to engage in the Herculean task of physically moving one rail inward for thousands of miles while under constant harassment from partisans. This meant that for the first crucial months of the war, the lifeline of the German army was constricted. It was like trying to water a vast forest with a garden hose. In logistics, there is a concept called ton miles, the cost of moving 1 ton of gear 1 mile. As the Germans pushed towards Moscow, the distance from their supply hubs in Poland grew to over 600 miles. Think about the wear and tear on a machine over 600 miles of potholes and trenches. By October 1941, nearly 1/3 of the German truck fleet was out of commission due to lack of spare parts. They were winning battles, yes, but they were losing the war of attrition. The army at the front were forced to choose. Do we ask for more ammunition or do we ask for winter coats? Because the logistical pipe was so narrow, they couldn't have both. As the mud began to freeze in November, the German generals initially felt a sense of relief. The ground hardened, the tanks could move again. But this was a cruel trick of nature. The cold that hardened the ground also froze the grease in the German rifles and the oil in the tank engines.
The horses, already malnourished and exhausted from the mud season, began to drop dead the moment the temperature hit 20 below. Without the horses, the artillery couldn't move. Without the artillery, the infantry was defenseless against Soviet counterattacks. It was a domino effect of catastrophic proportions. The lightning war had been outrun by the simple, slow reality of geography. Hitler had built a machine for a sprint, but he had entered a world where the only thing that moved faster than his tanks was the arrival of the Russian winter. In the high-stakes world of international relations and warfare, there is an old rule: know your enemy as you know yourself. It's a bit of wisdom that has saved countless lives throughout history. But what happens when a leader's own prejudices act like a thick blindfold? In 1941, the German High Command didn't just underestimate the Soviet military, they fundamentally misunderstood the people they were fighting. This wasn't just a tactical error, it was a catastrophic failure of intelligence driven by a poisonous ideology. For years leading up to the invasion, Hitler and his inner circle referred to the Soviet Union as a Vormarsch, a mere obstacle, populated by what they termed Untermenschen, or subhumans. Many of us remember the propaganda of that era, the idea that the Slavic people were incapable of high-level organization or sustained industrial effort. The German plan, Operation Barbarossa, was built on the assumption that the Soviet state was a colossus with feet of clay. Hitler famously told General Jodl that they only had to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. Because they believed the Soviet people hated their own government and lacked the racial soul to resist, the Germans didn't plan for a long-term occupation or a resilient enemy. They planned for a collapse that never came. One of the most sobering rewards of studying history is seeing how arrogance is met by reality. While German intelligence suggested the Soviets were technologically backward, the reality on the ground was a rude awakening. In the first weeks of the invasion, German tank crews, confident in their Panzer III and IV models, encountered the Soviet T-34 and the KV-1. These weren't the primitive machines the ideology predicted. The T-34 featured sloped armor and a powerful 76mm gun that made the German anti-tank weapons look like pea shooters. Many German soldiers reported hitting these subhuman tanks dozens of times, only to see the shells bounce off harmlessly. But here is the purple value payoff. It wasn't just the tank, it was the capacity to build them. Ideology had told Hitler that the Soviets couldn't possibly outproduce Germany. In reality, the Soviet Union was in the process of moving entire factories east of the Ural Mountains, literally dismantling their industrial heartland and rebuilding it out of reach of German bombers. If you treat a population like animals, you shouldn't be surprised when they fight with the ferocity of a cornered lion. History suggests that in many parts of the Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine and the Baltic states, the local population was actually quite disillusioned with Stalin's brutal regime. Some initially greeted the German soldiers with bread and salt, hoping for liberation from the Soviet yoke. But Hitler's ideology forbade a partnership with these people. Instead of recruiting them as allies, the SS and the Einsatzgruppen followed the army with orders to enslave, starve, and liquidate. Therefore, the Germans turned a potential fifth column of allies into a massive, desperate partisan movement. By treating the locals as subhuman, the Nazis left them with no choice but to fight to the death. The mystery of why the Soviet Union didn't collapse is solved by the very brutality of the German occupation. The Russian people realized that as bad as Stalin was, Hitler represented total extinction. In the high-stakes world of military intelligence, you are only as good as the questions you are allowed to ask. In Berlin, reporting anything that contradicted the Führer's worldview was a dangerous career move. Therefore, the German Abwehr, military intelligence, consistently lowballed the Soviet reserves. They estimated that the Soviets had about 200 divisions. By August, as we noted earlier, they had identified over 360. The German planners were shocked to find that for every Soviet army they destroyed, Stalin seemed to just snap his fingers and produce another one. This wasn't magic, it was the result of a massive, pre-planned mobilization system that the German racial experts had dismissed as impossible for a lesser people. By the time the German army reached the gates of Moscow, the toll of this miscalculation was written in the blood of 500,000 men. The soldiers were exhausted, the equipment was failing, and the subhumans they had expected to flee were launching massive counterattacks with sophisticated weaponry. The ideology had acted like a filter, letting in only the facts that felt good and straining out the ones that were true. Many of us have seen this in our own lives, the danger of underestimating an opponent because of pride. For the Third Reich, this wasn't just a mistake in a boardroom, it was the moment the war was lost. They had prepared to fight a mob. They found themselves fighting a nation that had been hardened into steel by the very cruelty intended to break it. In the high-stakes game of global conflict, information is the only currency that truly matters. But as we've seen throughout history, information is useless if the man at the top refuses to believe it. By the autumn of 1941, the German Wehrmacht was paralyzed by a single terrifying question: where are the rest of them? Hitler had been told the Soviet Union was out of men, yet fresh, well-equipped divisions continued to appear like ghosts out of the tree line. The answer to that mystery lay thousands of miles to the east, in the frozen expanse of Siberia, and in the hands of a man Hitler chose to ignore.
To understand the Siberian wildcard, we have to look at the map from Stalin's perspective. Most of us realize that fighting a war on two sides is a death sentence for any empire. While the Germans were battering at the gates of Moscow in the west, Stalin was terrified of a backdoor invasion in the east. Japan, a member of the Axis, had a massive, battle-hardened army stationed in Manchuria, right on the Soviet border. Stalin was forced to keep nearly 750,000 of his best troops, tough, winter-trained Siberian divisions, stationed in the Far East. These weren't the raw recruits the Germans had been chewing through. These were men who lived in sub-zero temperatures and moved on skis. As long as Japan was a threat, these men were locked in the east. Hitler knew this, and he assumed they would stay there. He gambled that the Japanese would eventually strike north, forcing Stalin to fight a two-front war he couldn't possibly win. Enter one of the most remarkable figures of the 20th century, Richard Sorge. To the world, he was a hard-drinking, womanizing German journalist working in Tokyo. To the Soviet Union, he was the most effective deep-cover agent in history. Sorge had successfully infiltrated the German embassy in Japan and had direct access to the most sensitive Axis communications. In late 1941, Sorge delivered a reward of intelligence that would shift the weight of the world. He informed Moscow that Japan had decided not to move north into Siberia, but was instead preparing for a southern strike against the United States and Great Britain, what we now know as the lead-up to Pearl Harbor. This meant the back door was safe. Stalin, a man not known for his trusting nature, took the ultimate gamble. Based on Sorge's word, he ordered the Siberian divisions to board trains and head west. Many of us who appreciate logistics can admire the sheer scale of what happened next. Using the Trans-Siberian Railway, Stalin moved over 20 divisions, 1,000 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft across 6 time zones in a matter of weeks. It was a logistical feat that the German intelligence services, hampered by their own subhuman narrative, deemed physically impossible. History suggests that the Germans were so convinced of their own superiority that they stopped looking for new threats. When German reconnaissance pilots spotted massive train movements in the east, the reports were often dismissed as refugees or labor battalions. Therefore, the German army remained in its summer uniforms, thin and exhausted, believing they were facing the final remnants of a broken enemy. On December 5, 1941, the temperature outside Moscow plummeted to nearly -40 degrees. The German Panzers were frozen solid. The soldiers were suffering from frostbite so severe that many were losing limbs. Just as the German offensive ground to a halt from sheer physical exhaustion, the Siberian wildcard was played. Out of the blinding white snow came the white ghosts, Siberian troops in white camouflage, equipped with submachine guns and supported by T-34 tanks that used special winter-grade oils. These men didn't just fight, they thrived in the conditions that were killing the Germans. The payoff for Stalin's gamble was immediate. The Germans, who had been within sight of the Kremlin spires, were thrown back over 100 miles in a matter of days. The tragedy for the German soldier was that this shouldn't have been a surprise. German intelligence had actually intercepted parts of Sorge's communications, and several high-ranking officers had warned Hitler that the Eastern reserves were more substantial than they appeared. But Hitler, blinded by his ideology, famously dismissed these reports as nonsense and Bolshevik propaganda. He believed his will was stronger than the reality of 25 fresh divisions. Therefore, the Siberian wildcard wasn't just a military reinforcement, it was a psychological hammer blow. For the first time in the war, the invincible Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The 500,000 men lost in those first months weren't just victims of the cold, they were victims of a leader who looked at a wild card and insisted it was a blank card. As the Siberian troops stabilized the front, the world began to realize that the Soviet Union wasn't going to fall in weeks, it was going to stand for years. And for the German army, the victory lap had turned into a long, cold walk into oblivion. In the final accounting of history, there is a recurring tragedy, the leader who wins every battle but loses the war. As the winter of 1941 settled over the blood-soaked plains of Russia, Adolf Hitler looked at his maps and saw a string of tactical masterpieces. He saw millions of prisoners taken at Kiev, Vyazma, and Bryansk. On paper, it looked like the greatest military success in the history of the world. But many of us who have lived through enough seasons know that a success that leaves you exhausted, exposed, and surrounded is not a victory. It is a funeral in slow motion. To understand why the German success was actually their undoing, we have to look at the Battle of Kiev. In August 1941, Hitler's generals wanted to push straight for Moscow. They believed taking the capital would decapitate the Soviet Union. But Hitler, ever the amateur strategist, insisted on diverting his tanks south to capture Kiev and the rich resources of Ukraine. Tactically, he was right. The maneuver resulted in the encirclement of over 600,000 Soviet troops. It was the largest kettle battle in history. Therefore, Hitler felt vindicated. He boasted that the war was won. But history suggests that the time bought by those 600,000 Soviet lives was the most expensive purchase Hitler ever made. By diverting his panzers, he delayed the assault on Moscow by 6 crucial weeks. Those 6 weeks were the difference between fighting in the dry dust of September and the waist-deep mud of October.
Most of us understand the concept of a diminishing return. For every mile the German army gained, the cost of holding that mile grew exponentially. By the time the sunset of the 1941 campaign arrived, the German army was a hollow shell of the force that had crossed the border in June. Here is the purple value payoff that few realize. By December 1941, the German army had suffered over 750,000 casualties. That was nearly 1/4 of their entire Eastern Front force. Even worse, the specialized units, the veteran tank commanders, the expert signals officers, the combat engineers, were the ones who had been hit hardest. These men were the institutional memory of the army. You cannot replace a veteran of 5 campaigns with a raw recruit and expect the same results. Therefore, while Germany still had an army, it no longer had the same army. It was a machine with worn-out gears, being asked to perform even greater miracles. There is a moment in every great struggle where the momentum shifts, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the men. For the first 6 months, the German soldier believed he was part of an inevitable force of nature. But as the strategic funeral began to unfold outside the gates of Moscow, that sense of inevitability vanished. The German soldiers were looking at their own frozen feet, wrapped in newspaper and rags because their boots were too small for thick socks. They were watching their comrades die of typhus and pneumonia. For the first time, the trusted friend at the front was writing letters home not about glory, but about survival. The but in this narrative is profound. The Germans had conquered more territory than any European power in history, but they had failed to break the will of their opponent. In fact, they had forged it into something unbreakable. Hitler's greatest failure was his inability to define what victory actually looked like. Was it the capture of Moscow, the destruction of the Red Army, the occupation of the Ural Mountains? Because he never committed to one, he ended up chasing all of them and catching none. By the end of 1941, the German army was stretched in a thin, jagged line from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They were in the middle of a continent, thousands of miles from home, facing a mobilized superpower that was just beginning to find its stride. The sunset wasn't just a change in the weather, it was the closing of the window of opportunity. Germany could not win a long war of attrition against the combined resources of the USSR, Great Britain, and the newly awakened United States. As we look back at those 500,000 men lost in those first months, we see the true cost of hubris. Hitler had promised a campaign of weeks. He delivered a catastrophe of years. He had traded his best men for miles of frozen steppe and scorched earth. The strategic funeral was the realization that the Blitzkrieg was dead. The era of the quick, decisive European war was over, replaced by a brutal industrial struggle of total annihilation. For the 65-year-old veteran or the student of history, the lesson is clear. Arrogance is the greatest force multiplier for your enemy. Hitler's tactical victory in 1941 was the very thing that ensured his strategic defeat in 1945. He had won the battle for the map, but he had lost the war for the future. We put a great deal of research into these documentaries to ensure the great captains of history are viewed with a critical eye. If you found value in our analysis of the Siberian wildcard or the logistical failures of 1941, please give this video a like. It tells the algorithm that there is still a hunger for long-form, thoughtful content. If you have a friend or a fellow history buff who remembers these stories differently, share this with them. We're building a library of high-retention history here, and your support is what keeps the lights on in the archives.